I mean, for goodness sake, one little piece of the tooth and you get a paper made. They operate on the slimmest of evidence, and they make massive stories out of it. So bear with me. I'm not an archaeologist, but I'm interested in the evolution of Fynbos and what are the things that govern the diversification of Fynbos. And archaeology provides an incredibly interesting backdoor into paleo environments. So I'm going to give you a paleo-environmental perspective of the Cape in the deepest, darkest, gloomiest ice age period that we've had around about 160,000 years ago, and how the hell did humans survive through that period? Okay, so nothing happened. The other button. Okay, this is not my work. This is the work of essentially a bunch of geologists, anthropologists, and what have you. Foremost is Kirsten Braun. She works on speleothems, stalactites. She's absolute genius with that stuff. Mirabar Matthews is her mentor, who's based in Israel. Kirsten is now at ASU, Arizona State University. Haley Cawthra, she's an absolute bomb. She's full of energy. She's a geologist working with the, what do they call it, Geological Survey, or what do they call it now? I don't know. Working for the staff. Curtis Marion, who's a real mensch. He's the paleoanthropologist. And he sets the big questions. And there's old Eric, who's an archaeologist, but really interested in gee-whiz sort of measuring stuff. And then a whole team of people who are backing this, many of whom you're going to see standing up today, the South Africans, but they're people from all over the world, from a whole array of disciplines. And what makes this really interesting is that, you know, we have a defining question which brings all these disciplines together. So we really have an interdisciplinary initiative. Okay, so we're going to look a little bit at human origins. The first thing I want you to look at is the scale at the bottom. We're talking of hundreds of thousands of years, okay? So we're looking at the Pleistocene. The Holocene is the last 10,000 years. We're looking at this long period here. And you can see that for most of that period, this line here is a proxy for temperature. For most of that period, it was cold. Okay? There were these tiny little warm periods, and we're in one now. So if you look at the last million years, 10% was nice and warm, like it is now, believe it or not. The rest of the time was much, much colder than it is now. Then if we look at human evolution during this period, around about 600,000 years ago, you started seeing a separation between Homo sapiens, us, and in Western Eurasia, there was Homo neanderthalensis. And there was a lot of gene flow between these two lineages up until about 300,000 years ago. And then, after that, there was very little gene flow. And the first evidence for the first Homo sapiens fossils came around about 200,000 years ago. So we're a fairly young species. About 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens emerged, and that period between about 100 and 200,000 years ago genetically defines the origin point of our lineage. So there's a whole lot of papers written about this very complex stuff that I don't understand, but essentially it says modern humans emerged in southern Africa between 100 and 160,000 years ago from an effective population size of 9,000 individuals. So something that you have to realize is that Homo sapiens, us guys, was a really useless species. Okay, we were distributed really sparsely over much of Africa. When the climate deteriorated, we were not well adapted to being able to survive. We had these big brains, but we hadn't wired them yet. And somewhere, our population survived. We would have classified ourselves as a red datable species back then. And somewhere, our population survived. And we think that that was in the southern Cape Coast. And I'm going to tell you why we think so. Okay, so the evidence for the emergence of modern humans comes from a bunch of caves on the Cape South Coast. Pinnacle Point, Nelson's Bay, Classy's River, a very important one, Blombos, and Kelder's. So archaeologists have been busy over decades excavating these caves. And one of the most amazing finds was at Pinnacle Point, which pushed back modern cognitive behavior to 165,000 years. So there was evidence there of ochre, of fine bladelets, of ornamentation, necklaces, and so on. These are all indicators of cultural activity. So this was the first time ever that this had been associated with Homo sapiens. And then there was this amazing understanding that humans, and this goes back 162,000 years, were acting as engineers. They were taking bits of silkcrete, which is a relatively rare rock type. They were bringing it, well, they were taking the silkcrete, they were applying fire, and for a specific time. This was something that you couldn't just sort of throw the clip in the fire. You had to actually develop the heat and enable that heat to impact on that rock for a certain amount of time, and then you would get a transformed material that you could make really fine bladelets and things with that. Now, in order to do that, you've got to have language. There's just no ways people could do a complex chain of activities like this without being able to communicate with language. And then, of course, the amazing find by Chris Henshelwood and his group 100,000 years ago, where they found the actual material. So they were using a perlemoon shell with a bit of ochre, and obviously grinding the ochre in that shell and using it for decoration or whatever. So all of this evidence is coming from the South Coast. Nowhere else in the world, even when deposits go through these periods, do we find this evidence. Okay, just getting back to, well, what was the climate like then? Well, it was miserable and cold. Okay, there we see that period from 100 to about 200,000 years ago. We were in the depths of a deep glacial. And what we have to remember is because we were in the depths of a deep glacial, the sea was far away. Because during glacials, a lot of water is held up in the ice caps, and it exposes the sea floor. And this is the work that Eric and his group did, Eric Fisher. So this is our period now that we're talking about, that 100 to 162,000 years ago. And we can see mostly the coast was very, very far away from the existing coastline. At times nearly up to 300 kilometers away. So there was a whole big bunch of land that was exposed during these glacial periods. So this is just a simple model. That's the Pinnacle Point area near Mossel Bay during an interglacial as we are now. And that's the Pinnacle Point area near Mossel Bay during glacial when it was cold. So there was an area the size of the existing Cape Floristic Kingdom that was out there. Okay? Not a trivial area, a big area. For most of the time, the Cape Floristic Kingdom was twice as big as it is at the moment. What did that area look like? Well, if you're sitting in Pinnacle Point now, staring out from one of the caves, and you have to time travel back 160,000 years ago, that's what you'd see. Not really. That's what we think you'd see. So we busy trying to create that paleoscape, trying to understand what that looked like. And a lot of the talks that you're going to hear now will speak to that general question. What did it look like? So fortunately, we've got Haley Cawthron, and Haley likes going offshore and diving down and taking photos. Haley would probably scream if she saw me put up the slide because it's such a grubby one and one of her earliest ones, but I don't have any better ones, so what the hell. Here is the coastline, okay. That's Mossel Bay, Cape St. Blaise. There we're going around to the mouth of the, down towards one of those places called Crib, whatever. This is the offshore deposits, immediately offshore, which are Cretaceous deposits, the richest soils that we have in the Cape. Okay, like you get in the Gamtoos Valley and the Chorus Valley. And there would have been times when these Cretaceous deposits would have been exposed. The sand would have blown off them, just like you find on the Namaqualand coast. So you would have had really rich soils offshore. And then, as you went further out to sea, you got soils like you get around the Hoek, okay? Limestone and and deeps and sand with a lot of big barrier dunes along this coastline. And it would have been dead flat. Okay, so let's look at a few kind of pictures. Some of you might know the road between Bredasdorp and Arniston. Okay? Absolutely flat. That's a little bit of the Paleogallus plain that's on shore at the moment. The rivers, like the Gorits and the Gamtoos, would have been very languid, and Haley's got evidence that the valley for the Gorits River, the valley offshore, was 30 k's wide. And all that alluvium would have collected in that valley. And the rivers would have been really languid with oxbow lakes, highly productive environments. And then behind the dunes there would have been these barrier lakes like you get at Wilderness and what have you. Barrier lakes full of sedges, lots of fresh water and so on. So now we come to the climate. So let's introduce Kirsten. Okay? So Kirsten has been going to Pinnacle Point and getting these stalactites. And these stalactites, or speleothems as you call them, are actually continuous data. You can slice those things up into daily records if you want to, if you can do it that fine. Okay? So we have this amazing record of what the climate was like based on some indicators from those speleothems. Now those indicators are not without their problems. Let's have a look at them. Anyway, there's old Kirsten. She likes caving. And this isn't actually what I'm talking about, but this is still by, but before they built a golf course, the sort of veg under the golf course was limestone, okay, with the limestone Fynbos on it. Not a lot of C4 plants, mainly restios. In other words, no tropical grasses in it, or very few today. Oh, now you get the okay, so this is the information you can get from those speleothems. Now, I'm just going to show you a few things, okay? Otherwise, you're going to fall asleep, I promise you. Look at the most important thing is look at the time period now. We've got a record of nearly 500,000 years. But in the end, you can break up into yearly slots if you can cut the slices fine enough. Okay. So we also have records offshore of what the proxies of what the temperature was like in the sea. And that little thing is represents, that line represents a proxy for warm temperatures, okay? It's the magnesium-calcium ratios in a little dinoflagellate, which is associated with the Indian Ocean water. And that one is for Atlantic water. So you see the one is much colder, the other one is much warmer. But the most important thing I want you to realize is that for a long period of this time, there were times when the sea temperatures were up to 22 degrees Celsius. Okay? So the Agulhas current remained by and large warm through all of these ice age fluctuations. This here is an indicator, this blue line, of whether the rain is coming from fronts, from the west, or whether it's coming with these high pressure systems like now from the east. So the oxygen isotope can tell you whether your rainfall is winter rain or whether it's coming with a summer rainfall system. And we can see here that there were huge fluctuations, with sometimes the rain coming from the summer rainfall system, sometimes from the winter rainfall system. This red line here gives you an indication of whether the vegetation was dominated by C3 plants, the normal plants that we have, fynbos shrubs, restios, or whether there were C4 grasses. And these are tropical grasses like Amida and Hyperemia and what have you, which are quite rare in the Cape today because it's a predominantly winter rainfall system. And again, you can see that there were times when the vegetation above that cave was an entirely C4 grassland. So it wasn't fynbos. There was a whole different biome there. So if we have a look at this time period, this was a period when you can see that there was a lot of summer rain, okay, but actually the C3 cycle was very strong. Here we have a period where there's a lot of summer rain and a very strong C4 signal. Okay, so I don't want to complicate you more with this picture other than to say it's telling us that there were times, even during cold periods, when the vegetation in that area above Pinnacle Point Cave was a grassland. It wasn't a fynbos biome. Okay? The fynbos biome wasn't there. So what is causing all of this stuff? And again, this is slightly complex stuff, and I'll go through it very slowly. So what we're finding at a peak interglacial, like now, we get the intertropical convergence zone is south, the polar front is pushed southwards, the westerlies bring a bit of rain to the southwest as part of the Cape, in the winter rainfall zone. But we're getting wind coming from the rain coming from the Indian Ocean affecting the southern part of the Cape, like we do now. So here we have non-seasonal rainfall. So that's in a peak interglacial. In a late interglacial, the intertropical convergence zone can move north, but the polar front is still south. And then we just get westerly. So the whole area could have winter rain and no summer rain. So then the fynbos would expand. And then during a glacial, which is really interesting. You get the polar front moving northwards, the intertropical convergence zone moving northwards. So these polar fronts strengthen. And what they do is that they strengthen the heat exchange between the warm air and the warm water and the cold water, and you get this red reflection, and you get a strengthening of the Agulhas current off the southeastern Cape. And a lot of rain with being advected off that much warmer ocean. So you can, during glacials, get lots of summer rain on the south coast. And if you combine that with the low carbon dioxide that you get during glacials, it can flip your system from a C3 dominated one to a C4 dominated one, even under cold climates. So a persistently warm Agulhas current provided that glacial refuge. An accident of geography enabled us to survive. Offshore on this Agulhas plain, and we know this because there's good data from the fossils, was a massive fauna, a plains-game fauna that included 3 species of zebra. There was springbok, there was this giant buffalo that's, horn span would go from here to that, to almost that table there. It was massive. There was a giant eland, a giant warthog, a giant hartebeest. These are things that have all gone extinct. So these were animals that occupied this offshore plain. There were also indications of the animals that we get now. So there was kudu, kreisbok, duiker. There was also waterbuck, waterbuck, all the way down during the glaciers off our coast. So a massive, how can I say, a massive fauna that existed off this coastline there. And we know that that fauna was largely coastal because we developed an isoscape of strontium from the soil and the rocks, and then looked at the bones of the animals that were collected from these caves, and we find that the strontium in the bones is all indicative of these animals remaining on the coast. So they were coastal. They didn't migrate between the Karoo and the coast. They stayed along the coast. We're still trying to figure out whether there was a migratory system moving east-west directions in association with the changes in rainfall seasonality. So one of the interesting things that we're beginning to look at now is the impact of climate stability on cultural development. You might recall from those horrendous pictures that I showed you, there were lots of spikes up and down. But I remember, if you're living on a flat landscape, a little spike in the temperature means a big area of land that's going to be under siege. So these fluctuations would have challenged people because in some cases, within the living lives or within the lifespans of individuals, coastlines would have disappeared, okay? Because the sea level was rising that quickly. And a long time ago, these guys wrote this paper that they were arguing that agriculture only emerged in the Holocene, because if you take the Holocene, the last 10,000 years, and you compare indicators of climate, you compare indicators of climate with any other period in the Pleistocene, the last 10,000 years is without doubt the most stable climate that we've ever experienced. So people are arguing that agriculture only developed in the Holocene simply because the climates were stable long enough people to move from hunting and gathering into agriculture. What I have next to this paper, which was written before we had these amazing records, are just some of the kind of fluctuations in these indicators of climate change that one was experiencing during the Pleistocene. And they were extremely rapid. Kirsten is beginning to work on this now, slicing these things up, so we can get decadal ideas of climate change over the last 500,000 years. And we want to test the hypothesis about climate stability and what it meant for cultural development amongst people in the Cape Floristic region. So this is something that Curtis put together. He's a very smart man. I could never come up with this stuff. But anyway, here we have a time scale going from 300,000 years ago when modern humans emerged all the way through to the present. And this is the emergence of the Middle Stone Age culture, where people had these bladelets, bifacials, Jan and others would know more about it. And then about 75,000 years ago, this is all in the middle of this really cold period, the Still Bay culture develops. Hey Jan, what's the Still Bay first? Eh? And that Still Bay culture all of a sudden shows a level of sophistication that you've never seen before. There's all sorts of bladelets and little arrowheads and what have you. Then it just disappeared. Boom. And then a little bit later, the Howisson's Poort culture developed. Like, this is humans starting to rev up the cultural engine again. And then it just disappeared. Boom. All that information was lost. The heat treating and so on and so forth. And then in the height of the last glacial, people must have been at such low population densities, we nearly went extinct again. There's no indication of us anywhere. And then the Holocene comes in, and now we start going ballistic again. So this is something that we're looking into in terms of a new project about the role of climate stability and cultural development and exchange between different groups and what have you. Okay, I think this is my last slide. So, glacial emergence of modern humans on the Cape South Coast. We emerged in an ice age, but we had this warmer Gullis current that was our saving grace. Otherwise, humans would have gone extinct. Homo sapiens would have gone extinct. The Paleo-Gullis plain was exposed to varying degrees, but remember, the Fynbos, for most of its region, most of the time in the last million years, has been double the size that it is now. And it was a completely different environment offshore. Influence of the warmer Gullis current, I mentioned. The region supported C4 grass-dominated biomes under certain circumstances. Fynbos and C4 grasses don't mix well. Eh? C4 grasslands can support fires at almost annually, and they probably outcompete the slower growing C3 plants. The fauna is suggestive of grasslands. It's a grazing fauna out there. Almost no grass. And rapid changes in sea level may have disrupted cultural evolution. That's it. Thank you very much.
The Fynbos would have retracted the summer rainfall coming in. So we have to revisit our hypothesis that Fynbos is a soil-driven system rather than climatic.
Well, okay. I must admit I was speaking largely about the lowlands. I think the mountains have always provided a refuge for animals. So that there's been, particularly say in the Southern Cape, as you move further east, where the proportion of summer rain has been consistently much higher, you get a mixture of grassland and Fynbos in the mountains. But I think the mountains have always been a refuge. And I think that things, and it's, I know that there are others in this room who would agree with me, that the mountains are a very different system. Not so much ecologically to lowland Fynbos, but in terms of the genesis of biodiversity. It's a much slower churning over system with a lot of geographic speciation and things like that. It's probably quite chock-a-block with species. But the lowlands have been areas where there's been lots of fluctuations, different soils exposed at different times, and a lot of opportunity for novel diversification. So the lowlands is where you find all your young and actively speciating claims. The mountains you find your more ancient elements. That's a generalization. But I really do think on those lowland soils, including limestone, that they would have been dominated by seafloor grasslands. You just got to go other side of the bay here. You find Alexandria limestone. Same kind of limestone as the Bredasdorp limestone. What do you have on it? Burnt felt. Little patches of thicket with a matrix of Bermuda grassland and little Fynbos shrubs, including things that you find in the limestone Fynbos down at the Wood.
Interestingly, you talked about the mammals, but you didn't mention the bluebuck.
Oh.
Was that an important one, or you just...
Yeah.